Chapter 1. The Invisible Watcher. The smell of horse manure and expensive perfume never did mix well. Up in the Blackwood Gala, the bass was a dull thud in my skull, like a headache that wouldn't quit. Down here in the dirt, the air was thick with the scent of hay and wet fur. It was my sanctuary. Still, I wasn't alone tonight. I stayed deep in the shadows of the third stall, my pitchfork biting into the soiled bedding. Truth be told, I liked being the invisible man. To the people in the silk dresses and tuxedos, I was just a part of the furniture. I was the stable boy, a nameless pair of shoulders meant to muck out the mess they left behind. Because of that, I saw everything. I saw the greed, the fake smiles, and the way they looked right through a man if his boots were caked in mud. Suddenly, the heavy stable doors creaked open. A sliver of moonlight cut across the floor, and in stepped Sophie Vane. She looked like a doll in that white dress, but her face was a mask of pure misery. She didn't see me. She headed straight for her mare, whispering words I wasn't meant to hear. "They want to sell me off, girl," she murmured, her hand stroking the horse's neck. "Just another piece of property to bail them out." Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I watched her from the dark, my breath held tight in my lungs. She was the socialite queen, the one I was supposed to hate on principle. Yet, as she leaned her forehead against the mare's velvet nose, she didn't look like a predator. She looked like a prisoner. Maybe it was fate that made me step out of the shadows. I didn't want to scare her, but the pitchfork scraped against the stone. Before she could move, I was standing in the dim light. Her eyes went wide. She didn't scream, though. She just stared at my dirty face and my worn-out flannels. "You're late," I said, my voice like gravel. "The horses don't care about your party." She didn't recoil. Instead, she let out a small, jagged breath. "The horses are the only ones worth talking to tonight." Moments later, she reached into a pocket of her dress. She pulled out a napkin-wrapped bundle and held it out to me. Inside was a thick slice of chocolate cake from the gala, the kind of stuff that cost more than a stable hand made in a week. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Better you have it than the vultures up there." The moment our eyes locked, I felt a shift in the air. I took the cake, my rough fingers brushing against her soft skin. It was a spark that shouldn't have been there. She was a Vane, and I was the man who owned every acre she stood on, though she didn't know it. Deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't just watching her anymore, I was seeing her. As the silence stretched, the music from the gala seemed miles away. I bit into the cake, and it tasted like rebellion. Chapter 2. The Auction Block. Eleanor Vane walked into the stables like she owned the sky, her heels clicking against the stone like a death march. She didn't see me crouching by the tack room. I was just a shadow again. To her, I was less than the dirt under her fingernails. "Sophie, get away from that animal," Eleanor barked. Her voice was like a whip cracking in the cold air. "Your mascara is a mess, and Richard is waiting to announce the date." Sophie straightened up, her spine turning to steel. "The date for what, Mother? My funeral?" "Don't be dramatic," Eleanor snapped, stepping closer. "Richard's father is the key to the merger. You will smile, you will dance, and you will marry him because I said so." What followed was a cold silence that made the horses restless. Eleanor looked at her daughter like a rancher looks at a prize cow. There was no love in those eyes, only math. She didn't care about the light fading in Sophie's soul. In fact, she seemed to enjoy snuffing it out. I felt a growl rising in my throat. I had to bite my tongue to keep from stepping out and telling Eleanor exactly whose land she was standing on. But then, I remembered my mask. If I broke character now, I'd lose the only advantage I had. Still, my hand gripped the handle of my shovel so hard the wood groaned. "He's a monster, Mother," Sophie whispered. "He treats people like objects." "And you are an expensive object, Sophie," Eleanor replied, her tone breezy and confident. "Start acting like one." Eleanor turned on her heel and marched out, leaving the air smelling like poison and expensive lilies. Sophie stood there, trembling in the middle of the aisle. Her world was tilting, and she had nowhere to run. She looked at the mare, then her gaze drifted toward the dark corner where I was hiding. The tension broke when she let out a sob she tried to hide behind her hand. I stepped forward, the straw crunching under my boots. I didn't know what to say. I was a reclusive baron hiding in a stable boy's skin, and she was a girl being sold to the highest bidder. "She's wrong, you know," I muttered. Sophie looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "What do you know about it, Silas? You're just the guy who cleans the stalls." "I know that horses kick when they're cornered," I said, my voice low and steady. "Maybe you should try it." Under the weight of my stare, she seemed to find a spark of her own. She wiped her eyes and stood taller. Between them, something cracked. It was the last bit of her obedience falling away. Chapter 3: The Secret Power. The night was cold, and the shack on the edge of the woods felt like a tomb. I sat at my rough wooden table, the only light coming from the blue glow of an encrypted laptop. This was the real Silas Thorne. Not the boy with the pitchfork, but the man who held the deeds to every house in the county. I clicked a button, and a land development permit appeared on the screen. It was Eleanor Vane's last hope. She wanted to turn the old thorn forest into a strip mall to pay off her debts. In that moment, I felt a rush of cold power. With a single click, I could end her. I could leave the Vanes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Because of her greed, she was willing to destroy the very land that fed her. That's why I did it. I denied the permit. I watched the status change to rejected and felt a grim satisfaction. I was the secret landlord, and they were the beggars at my gate. Yet, as the silence roared in the small room, my thoughts drifted back to the stable. I thought about the chocolate cake and the way Sophie's hand had trembled. Was I any better than her mother? I was playing God with their lives while hiding in a hut. Maybe it was fate that I was the one who could save her, or maybe I was just another monster in the dark. Without warning, a notification pinged on the screen. The Vane family had just filed for emergency credit. They were desperate. They were sinking fast, and they didn't know I was the one pulling them under. In the span of a breath, I realized I was winning the war I'd started years ago. I had consolidation, I had the deeds, and I had the power. But then, I looked at the empty chair across from me. Truth be told, I had everything but a reason to care. What followed was a restless hour of staring at the screen. I was the king of a ghost town. I had weaponized my invisibility so well that I had disappeared from the world entirely. Even so, I couldn't get the girl in the white dress out of my head. She was the only elite who had looked at me like I was a person. Soon after, I shut the laptop. I walked to the window and looked toward the Vane estate in the distance. The lights were twinkling, but I knew the darkness was closing in on them. I felt it, clear as day. Something was coming, and it would change everything. That night, I didn't dream of land or money. I dreamed of a girl who offered cake to a ghost. Chapter 4: The Desperate Proposal. The morning air was sharp enough to cut bone. I was back in the dirt, my muscles aching from a night of staring at glowing screens. I thought I was alone until the stable doors slammed open. Sophie didn't walk in. She collided with the room. Her hair was a mess. Her expensive riding boots were covered in mud. Her chest was heaving. "Marry me," she gasped. I froze with a shovel full of manure. Truth be told, I thought I'd finally lost my mind from solitude. I looked at her, searching for the punchline, but her face was pale as a ghost. Because of her mother's pressure, she looked like a cornered animal ready to bite. "I'm a stable boy, Sophie," I said, my voice like low thunder. "Go back to your party." "No," she yelled, her voice echoing off the rafters. "My mother just announced the engagement. Richard is coming for me tonight. If I'm already married, to someone beneath us, she can't force the merger. It ruins everything she's built." I felt a shock of cold realization. This wasn't a prank. This was a suicide mission for her social life. In that moment, I saw the desperation in her eyes. She was willing to throw away $1 billion inheritance just to be free of the Vane name. She was choosing nothing because she thought I was nothing. "You don't know what you're asking," I muttered, stepping closer. "You'd be living in a shack. You'd have dirt under your nails and no one to call for help." "I don't care," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'd rather starve with a man who sees me than feast with a man who owns me." Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed her shoulders. Her skin was like ice. I could feel the heat of my own power bubbling under the surface. If I said yes, the humanity test would truly begin. I wanted to see how far this socialite would go before she broke. "Fine," I growled. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Chapter 5. The Stolen Vows. The courthouse was a gray, miserable building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. We stood before a tired clerk who didn't even look up from his coffee. I was wearing my best flannel, which still smelled faintly of the stalls. Sophie was in a simple coat she'd grabbed on the way out. "Sign here," the clerk said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. What followed was a moment where time stood still. Sophie picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking so hard the nib scratched against the wood. Still, she didn't hesitate. She signed her name, forfeiting her future for a lie. She was marrying a peasant to save herself from a prince. I signed my name next. I didn't use the Thorne family seal. I just wrote Silas, a simple name for a simple man. As the clerk stamped the paper, I felt the world tilt. The ordinary world was officially dead. I was no longer just the landlord watching from the shadows. I was her husband. "Congratulations," the clerk droned. "Next." As we walked out into the rain, the silence roared between us. Sophie looked down at the cheap gold band I'd bought at a pawn shop on the way. It looked wrong on her delicate finger, yet she held onto my arm like I was a life raft in a storm. "My mother will burn the county down when she finds out," she said, a small, dark smile playing on her lips. "Let her," I replied, my heart skipping a beat. "I own the county. She just doesn't know it yet." She laughed, thinking I was making a joke. Little did she know, the man walking beside her had enough money to buy her mother's soul 10 times over. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was fascinated by her. She had rescued the stable boy, unaware that the stable boy was the one holding the leash. Chapter 6. The Shack at the Edge of the World. That night, the rain turned to sleet. I drove my beat-up truck down the dirt path that led to my home. The shack was a one-room disaster with peeling paint and a porch that groaned under every step. I pulled up and killed the engine, the silence of the woods swallowing us whole. "We're here," I said, watching her face. Sophie looked at the shack. She looked at the windows that rattled in the wind and the wood stove that was cold as a grave. I was waiting for the "I made a mistake" speech. I was waiting for her to demand a hotel or a ride back to the mansion. Instead, she stepped out of the truck and onto the muddy grass. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just looked at the dark forest and then back at me. "It's quiet," she said softly. "It's a dump," I countered, testing her. "The roof leaks. The heat is whatever wood you can chop. Are you ready to play house, Sophie?" She walked up to me, the rain soaking into her hair. "I'm not playing, Silas." What's worse was the guilt that started to prick at my chest. I had a heated estate 5 miles away with a chef and a king-sized bed. Yet, here I was, forcing her into the cold just to see if she was real. To make things worse, she looked at me with a trust that I hadn't earned. "Where are the extra blankets?" she asked, her voice steady. In that moment, everything changed. She wasn't breaking. She was adapting. I walked toward the door, my thoughts spinning. I have a wife now. A wife who thought I was a nobody. I reached for the handle, knowing that once we stepped inside, there was no turning back. As the wind shifted, Carrying the scent of pine and old secrets, I realized the war with Eleanor was nothing compared to the war I was about to have with my own heart. Chapter 7: The Battle of the Blisters. The sun didn't rise the next morning. It just turned the sky a flat, bruised gray. I woke up to the sound of metal clattering and a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. Sophie was on her knees in front of the wood stove, her face smudged with soot and her silk sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She was trying to feed a log into a fire that refused to catch. "It's dead," I muttered, my voice thick with sleep as I watched her from the small cot. "It's not dead, it's just stubborn," she snapped, blowing into the embers until a cloud of ash turned her blonde hair gray. I stayed still, watching her hands. They were red and starting to blister from the rough wood. Part of me, the part that owned a fleet of luxury cars, wanted to jump up, grab the hidden satellite phone, and order a 5-course breakfast and a team of contractors. But the landlord in me stayed quiet. I needed to see if this was a tantrum or a transformation. Because of her pride, she wouldn't ask for help. She kept striking matches until a small orange flame finally licked the kindling. She sat back on her heels, a triumphant look on her face despite the black smudge across her nose. "Breakfast is cold cereal," she announced, looking at the single box on the counter. "But at least the house isn't a freezer anymore." "You look like a chimney sweep," I said, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "In fact, I think it's a better look than the debutante gown," she joked, wiping her forehead and only making the soot worse. Still, I saw the way her shoulders slumped when I wasn't looking. She was exhausted. She was a girl who had never poured her own orange juice, and now she was fighting a cast-iron stove for warmth. As the silence stretched, I realized my test was becoming a slow torture. Chapter 8: The Shopkeeper's Slip Moments Later. We were in the truck, heading to the general store in town. I needed supplies, and Sophie needed to see what normal life looked like. The general store was run by Old Man Miller, a man who had paid his mortgage to my holding company for 30 years. By the time we walked in, Miller was already behind the counter. His eyes went wide when he saw me. He started to straighten his apron, his hand moving toward his hat to give a respectful tip. I shot him a look, a cold, predatory glare that told him to keep his mouth shut or lose his lease. "Morning, Silas," Miller stammered, his voice trembling. "What can I, get for you and the lady?" "Just the basics, Miller. Flour, coffee, and whatever's on the discount shelf," I said, emphasizing the word discount. Sophie was busy browsing the 99-cent aisle, looking at cans of beans like they were artifacts in a museum. She didn't notice the way Miller's hands shook as he rang up our items. She didn't see the confusion in his eyes as he watched the king of the county count out rumpled $5 bills. "That'll be $12.50, Miller whispered. "Wait," Sophie said, stepping forward. She pointed at the screen. "You charged him for the premium coffee. This is the store brand. It's $2 cheaper." Miller looked at me, then back at her. "Oh, I thought—" "He works hard for his money," Sophie said, her voice firm and protective. "Don't try to take advantage of him just because he looks like he spends his day in a barn." Truth be told, I almost choked on my own heart. She was defending me. She was standing up for the poor stable boy against a man who knew I could buy the entire street. Not only that, but she looked proud of the $2 she'd saved me. Chapter 9: The Shadow in the Woods. What followed was a quiet drive back, but the peace didn't last. As we pulled up to the shack, a black sedan was idling in the tall grass. A man in a sharp suit stood by my porch, looking at the peeling paint with disgust. It was one of Eleanor's private investigators. "Silas Thorne?" the man asked, his voice oily and arrogant. "Who's asking?" I stepped out of the truck, my body moving on instinct to stand between the man and Sophie. "I have a message from Mrs. Vane. She's filing for an annulment based on coercion. She thinks you've kidnapped her daughter," the investigator said, smirking at the shack. "Look at this place. It's a crime scene waiting to happen." Sophie stepped out from behind me, her eyes flashing with a fire I'd never seen. "I wasn't kidnapped. I'm his wife. Tell my mother to stay off our land." "Our land?" The investigator laughed. "This dirt is worth nothing. You're living in a hole, Sophie. Come home before your reputation is completely dead." I stepped forward then, dropping the stable boy slouch. I looked at the man with a cold, terrifying authority that made his smirk vanish instantly. I didn't raise my voice, but the weight of my stare felt like a physical blow. "The girl told you to leave," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If I see this car on this property again, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose the ability to find work in this state. Am I clear?" The investigator blinked, his mouth falling open. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost or a wolf in sheep's clothing. Without another word, he scrambled into his car and sped off, kicking up a cloud of red dust. As the wind shifted, Sophie turned to me, her brow furrowed. "Silas, where did a stable boy learn to look at a man like he's a bug?" Her voice trembled, and I knew the mask was cracking. She felt it, clear as day. I wasn't just the man who mucked the stalls. Chapter 10, The Siege of the Shack. The silence after the investigator left was heavier than the sleet. I looked at Sophie, and for a second, I thought I'd lost her. She was staring at me like I was a stranger she'd found in the dark. Because of that one moment of cold authority, I had put a crack in the stable boy lie that no amount of dirt could fill. "I grew up around men like that," I lied, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. "You learn how to talk to bullies, or you get crushed by them." Sophie didn't look convinced. Rather, she seemed to be measuring the width of my shoulders and the stillness in my eyes. Before she could speak, a low rumble vibrated through the floorboards of the porch. It wasn't thunder. It was the mechanical growl of heavy machinery. What followed was a nightmare in yellow. Two massive bulldozers emerged from the tree line, their steel blades raised like the teeth of a predator. Right behind them, Sophie Vane stepped out of a sleek SUV, her designer coat fluttering in the wind like a battle flag. "If you won't leave him, Sophie, I'll remove the roof from over your head," Eleanor screamed over the roar of the engines. "This land is part of the Blackwood Trust. I'm reclaiming it." "This isn't your land," Sophie yelled, running toward the edge of the porch. The first bulldozer didn't stop. It lurched forward, its tread crushing my small vegetable garden. I felt a surge of white-hot fury. I hated that I couldn't solve this with a checkbook without losing Sophie's trust, but I couldn't let her get hurt. To make things worse, Sophie didn't back down. She stepped directly into the path of the lead machine, her arms spread wide. Chapter 11, The Shift in Power. "Stop!" I lunged, my body moving on instinct, and tackled Sophie back toward the porch just as the blade hissed through the air. The driver didn't care. He was paid by the Vanes, and in this county, the Vanes were supposed to be gods. Still, they didn't know who was really pulling the strings. I pulled Sophie behind my back, my hand dipping into my pocket. I gripped my phone, my thumb hovering over a speed dial that would end Eleanor's life as she knew it. "Silas, do something!" Sophie choked out, her fingers digging into my arm. In that moment, everything changed. I stopped being the observer. I pulled my phone out and stepped into the clearing. I didn't hide it. I didn't care. I made a single call to the Chief Justice of the county. "This is Silas Thorne," I said, my voice cutting through the mechanical roar. "Execution of the Thorne Preservation Act. Immediately. Shut it down." Moments later, the world went silent. The bulldozers jerked to a halt as if they'd hit an invisible wall. The drivers checked their tablets, their faces turning pale. Eleanor marched forward, her heels sinking into the mud. "What is this? Why have you stopped?" she shrieked at the driver. The land just went into a permanent court-ordered stay," the driver stammered. "The owner, the actual owner, just filed an injunction. We'll be arrested if we move another inch." Eleanor turned to me, her eyes darting between my dirty face and the high-end phone in my hand. She felt it, clear as day. The power in the air had shifted. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the one holding the cage door shut. Chapter 12. The First Embers. The bulldozers retreated like beaten dogs, leaving deep, ugly scars in the mud. Eleanor followed them, her face a mask of baffled rage. She didn't understand how a stable boy could stop a demolition, but she knew she'd been outplayed. As the dust settled, the space between Sophie and me burned. "Silas?" she whispered. Her voice trembled as she looked at the phone in my hand. "How did you do that? Who did you call?" I looked at her, and the weight of the lie felt like a stone in my throat. I couldn't tell her everything, not yet. I told her a half-truth, a desperate bridge to keep her from walking away. "I'm not just a stable hand, Sophie," I said, stepping closer. I do some work for a firm that tracks land deeds. I know where the bodies are buried in this county. I called in a favor." Maybe it was fate, or maybe she was just as desperate for a reason to stay as I was to keep her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she grabbed the front of my shirt and pulled me down. The kiss was desperate and honest, tasting of rain and adrenaline. Her body moved on instinct, pressing against mine as the tension of the day broke. It was a hungry, predatory focus that made my thoughts spin. I realized then that I had fallen in love with the only person who loved my nothing, but the nothing was becoming harder to maintain. Later that night, as she slept by the wood stove, I sat on the porch. My chest ached with a secret I couldn't keep much longer. Truth be told, I was terrified. She thought we were a team of outlaws fighting the world. What would happen when she found out I was the one who owned the world? Soon after, I heard a floorboard creak inside. I went back in and saw her by the door, holding my boots. She had been cleaning the mud off them. As she turned them over, a small silver satellite phone fell out of the lining. As the silence roared, she looked from the phone to me. Chapter 13. The Heart of the Labyrinth. The satellite phone lay on the floorboards like a live grenade. Sophie looked at the sleek, military-grade tech, then up at me, her eyes wide with a cold, sharp realization. The silence in the shack was no longer peaceful. It was a roar of unspoken questions. "Favors don't come with encrypted hardware, Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Who are you?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was a weight that would crush the tiny world we'd built. Instead, I walked over, picked up the phone, and took her hand. My touch was firm, a silent plea for her to trust me one more time. I led her to the small cellar door hidden beneath the rug in the corner. What followed was the end of the stable boy forever. I pulled back the hatch and led her down the stairs. The air changed from the scent of damp wood to the sterile, filtered hum of high-end electronics. The cellar wasn't a root cellar, it was a state-of-the-art command center. Wall-to-wall monitors flickered with topographic maps, legal deeds, and live financial feeds of the Vane estate. "I don't just work for a firm, Sophie," I said, my voice echoing in the small space. "I am the firm. I own the deeds. I own the mortgages. Truth be told, I own the debt your mother has been drowning in for 10 years. Sophie stood frozen, the blue light of the screens reflecting in her eyes. She looked at a map that highlighted the Blackwood Riding Club in blood red. Below it, the owner's name was listed: Thorne Land Management. "You're the landlord," she breathed, her world tilting. "You watched me. You watched all of us. You mucked stalls while you held our lives in your hands. Was any of this real? Or was I just another parcel of land to acquire?" Chapter 14. The blood-red debt. The space between us burned with her hurt. I stepped into her light, my heart skipping as I saw the betrayal on her face. Because of my fear of being loved for my crown, I had almost destroyed the person who loved my soul. "It was a test," I admitted, my voice low and raw. "I wanted to see if anyone in your world had a heart that wasn't for sale. I thought I'd found it in the stables, but I was too much of a coward to tell you the truth." Sophie laughed, a jagged, hollow sound. "A test? You let me blister my hands and freeze in this shack just to see if I was worthy of your empire? That's not love, Silas. That's a siege. She turned to leave, her body moving on instinct to get away from the screens and the lies. I grabbed her arm, not to stop her, but to show her the monitor in the center of the room. It showed Eleanor's private offshore accounts, highlighted in yellow. Your mother isn't just broke, Sophie, I said, the words rushing out. She's been embezzling from the town's pension fund to keep the club afloat. She was going to sell you to Richard to cover the hole before the auditors arrived. I didn't marry you to win a game. I married you to take you off the auction block. She stopped. Her breath caught as she read the numbers on the screen. Not only that, but she saw the dates. I had been blocking Eleanor's predatory deals long before I ever spoke to Sophie in that stall. I had been her silent guardian before I was ever her husband. You've been fighting her this whole time? She asked, her voice trembling. Deep down, I knew the truth, I said, stepping closer until I could feel the heat of her skin. I couldn't let her destroy the land, and I couldn't let her destroy you. I'm the monster who owns the county, Sophie. But I'm a monster who belongs to you. Chapter 15, The Architects of Ruin. What followed was a slow, tentative surrender. Sophie didn't run. Rather, she reached out and touched the screen, her finger tracing the borders of the land she loved. She looked at me, and while the hurt was still there, a new fire was blooming beneath her skin. If you have all this power, she said, her voice turning cold and calculated, then why are we still hiding? Why haven't you finished with her? Because if I move too soon, she'll liquidate the club and vanish with the money, I explained. I need to bait her into one final move. I need her to think she's winning. Sophie's eyes locked onto mine, and the tension broke into a dark, shared resolve. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the partner. She reached for the keyboard, her vintage leather jacket creaking as she sat in my chair. She's planning a nuclear option for the land board meeting on Friday, Sophie said, her thoughts spinning. She wants to force a sale of the Thornwoods by claiming you're a squatter. Let's give her what she wants. Let's make her think she's finally trapped with the stable boy. We spent the night in the glow of the monitors, a team of outlaws with the resources of a king. As the sky darkened outside, I realized that for the first time, I wasn't lonely in my command center. I had a wife who wasn't afraid of the monster. She was ready to lead the pack. Even so, as I watched her sleep with her head on the desk, a notification pinged on my private line. Eleanor had hired a specialist. Not an investigator, but a cleaner. Someone to scrub the stable boy out of existence permanently. In the stillness that followed, I realized the war was no longer about land. It was about survival. Chapter 16. The Poisoned Fruit. The morning didn't bring light. It brought a cold, suffocating fog that swallowed the shack whole. I was out back chopping wood, trying to work the restless energy out of my muscles, when I heard the tires on the gravel. It wasn't the roar of a bulldozer. It was the quiet, predatory hum of a luxury sedan. By the time I reached the porch, Sophie was already standing there. She held a thick, yellow envelope in her hands. Her face wasn't angry. It was empty. It was the look of someone who had seen the bottom of a grave and realized they were already lying in it. Sophie? I stepped toward her, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. You knew, she whispered. Her voice was so thin, the wind almost stole it. She pulled a document from the envelope, a dated purchase offer for the Vane estate from 3 years ago. It was signed by Thorne Land Management. You didn't marry me to save me, Silas. You've been hunting my family for years. It was just the final signature you needed to complete the set. No, Sophie, listen to me. I reached for her, but she recoiled as if my touch was acid. What's worse was the photograph that followed. It was a shot of me, months ago, sitting in a boardroom in a $5,000 suit looking cold and untouchable. Next to it was a faked memo, planted by Eleanor's cleaner, stating that the stable boy persona was a psychological tactic to facilitate the acquisition of the Vane daughter. At that moment, everything we had built in the mud and the cold turned to ash. Because of my own secrets, Eleanor had found the perfect lie. She had framed my love as a corporate takeover. Sophie looked at the shack, then at me, and I saw the radical empathy in her eyes die a flickering death. Chapter 17. The Iron Cage. I was a test to you? Sophie's voice finally broke, rising into a jagged scream. You wanted to see if I had a heart? Well, congratulations, Silas, you found it. And then you stepped on it just to see what was inside. Sophie, she's lying. She's trying to drive you away because she knows I'm the only one who can stop her. I roared, but the roar felt hollow. The evidence looked too perfect. I had been a landlord long before I was a husband, and that truth was a poison I couldn't drain. Before she could speak, the fog was torn apart by the blue and red strobe of police lights. 4 cruisers skidded into the clearing, their sirens wailing like banshees. Without warning, officers swarmed the porch, their weapons drawn. Silas Thorne, hands behind your back, a voice commanded. It was the local sheriff, a man whose daughter's college tuition I had anonymously paid last year. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. Eleanor had played her hand perfectly. She had filed charges of coerced marriage and financial fraud, using her last remaining influence to buy a temporary badge of justice. Don't do this, I growled as the cold iron of the handcuffs bit into my wrists. I looked at Sophie, pleading with her to see the truth. Sophie, don't go back to her. It's a trap. She didn't move. She stood on the porch of the shack we had shared, clutching the poisoned documents to her chest. As the officers shoved me into the back of the cruiser, she turned her back on me. She walked toward the black sedan, waiting at the edge of the woods. As the silence roared in the back of the car, I watched the shack disappear into the fog. I had lost the girl, I had lost the land, and for the first time in my life, I felt the true weight of the nothing I had pretended to be. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. The holding cell smelled of bleach and old despair. I sat on the concrete bench, staring at the shadows dancing on the opposite wall. The sheriff had taken my phone. My lawyers were being blocked by a temporary security hold. For the first time in a decade, the king of the county was truly invisible. I realized then that my test had been an act of supreme arrogance. I had wanted to be loved without the crown, but I had used the crown to manipulate the world around her. Truth be told, I deserved this cell. I had been so afraid of being a target that I had become a hunter, and in doing so, I had hunted the only thing that made my life worth living. You have a visitor, the guard grumbled, tapping on the bars. I looked up, expecting my lead counsel or perhaps a gloating Eleanor. Instead, I saw a familiar pair of worn riding boots. My breath caught. My chest ached with a hope so sharp it felt like a blade. Sophie, I whispered, standing up. But it wasn't Sophie. It was one of the stable hands from the Blackwood Club, a kid named Toby who I'd helped with his rent when his mother got sick. He looked terrified, glancing over his shoulder before leaning against the bars. She's at the estate, Mr. Silas, Toby hissed. They've got her locked in the library. Your wife. She found something. She found the real files in your cellar before they dragged her away. She knows the documents were fakes, but Eleanor is taking her to the land board meeting in an hour to force the annulment. If she signs, everything you own goes into a state freeze. Something inside me shifted. The wall-to-wall monitors and the billions in the bank hadn't saved me, but a kid I'd treated like a person was standing here risking his life. I looked at Toby, and the reclusive Baron died once and for all. Toby, I said, my voice turning into a low, predatory growl. I need you to go to the hardware store. Tell Miller the landlord is calling in his final favor. As the wind shifted outside the high cell window, I realized I didn't need a crown to win this war. I just needed my wife. Chapter 19. The Reckoning at the Bars. The heavy iron door of the precinct groaned open, and the silence of the hallway was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic click of heels. I stood up, my pulse racing against the cage of my ribs. The guard stepped aside, looking pale and nervous, and there she was. Sophie didn't look like a broken debutante. She looked like a storm that had finally found its path. "I found the real ledger, Silas," she whispered, her voice a low vibration that made my bones remember her. "Beneath the false documents in the cellar, I found the handwritten notes you kept. You weren't tracking a merger. You were tracking the names of every family my mother was trying to evict. Sophie." I reached through the bars, my fingers brushing the leather of her jacket. "Truth be told, I almost let them take you," she said, her eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, radical empathy. "But then I remembered the cake. A man who wants to own the world doesn't share stolen cake with a stranger in the dark. I didn't marry a landlord, Silas. I married the man who gave me half of his nothing when he thought I had everything." At that moment, the tension broke. She slid a small, heavy object through the bars. My encrypted satellite phone. Miller from the general store had delivered it to her under the nose of the sheriff's deputies. Because of her, I was no longer a prisoner. I was the commander of a counterstrike. "They're taking me to the land board in 20 minutes, she said, her voice turning to steel. "Eleanor thinks I'm going to sign the annulment and the land transfer. She thinks she's finally won the Vane legacy back." "Let her think it," I growled, my thumbs flying over the keypad. "I'm calling in every favor, every deed, and every debt in this county. By the time we reach that podium, she won't just be broke. She'll be irrelevant." Chapter 20. The mobilization. What followed was a flurry of invisible warfare. From a concrete cell, I bypassed the local server and sent a single, high-priority alert to the state auditor's office. I didn't need a lawyer, I had the truth. And the truth was a fire that Eleanor Vane had spent 20 years trying to outrun. Not only that, but I sent a message to the invisible people, the stable hands, the shopkeepers, and the waitresses who had felt the Vane family's heel on their necks. "Toby is waiting out back with a truck," Sophie said, her thoughts spinning as she checked the hallway. "The sheriff is distracted. Half the force just got a notification that their mortgages were being investigated for Blackwood interference. They're more worried about their own homes right now than your cell door." "Maybe it was fate," I muttered, looking at her, "that the only person who could break me out of my own isolation was the one person I tried to hide from." Without another word, she used the key she'd swiped from a frantic deputy's desk. The lock clicked, a sound of finality that echoed through the precinct. I stepped out, the cold air of the hallway hitting me like a rebirth. We moved on instinct, slipping through the back exit and into the cab of Toby's beat-up Ford. "To the town hall," I commanded, my voice regaining the calculated authority of the land baron. "And Toby, drive like the devil is chasing us, because for Eleanor Vane, he is." As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and impending justice, I looked at Sophie. She was checking the ammunition of our legal files, her blonde hair messy and her eyes burning. I realized then that the test was over. She had chosen the man in the dirt over the man in the suit, and now I was going to give her both. Chapter 21. The approach to the summit. The town hall loomed at the end of the street, its white pillars glowing under the moonlight like the ribcage of a dead beast. Scores of people were already gathered, reporters, board members, and the desperate elite of Blackwood. They were waiting for the final act of the Vane family's resurrection. "She thinks she has the final parcel," I said, looking at the building. "She thinks that with your signature, she can bulldoze the Thorne Woods and build her mall. She has no idea she's walking into a graveyard." "Still," Sophie said, grabbing my hand, "she's dangerous when she's cornered. She'll try to destroy us both before she lets go of that gavel." "Let her try," I replied. I reached into the back seat and pulled out a garment bag Toby had retrieved from my estate. I stripped off the grime-stained flannel and put on the charcoal gray suit. It felt heavy, like armor. I looked like a king, but as I looked at Sophie, I felt like a husband. Moments later, we stepped out of the truck. The crowd parted as if summoned by a ghost. They didn't see the stable boy. They saw a man whose gaze held the horizon of the entire county. Sophie walked beside me, her vintage leather jacket a defiant contrast to the silk and lace around her. As the sky darkened, the doors to the assembly hall swung open. The air thickened with the scent of old wood and the rot of hidden secrets. Eleanor Vane stood at the front, the gavel in her hand, looking out at the room with a predatory smile. The moment our eyes locked, the room went silent. The echo of our footsteps was the only sound in the hollow chamber. The air thickened as I stepped toward the podium, knowing the truth was about to unravel the world. Silas Thorne, Chapter 22, The Climax, The Fall of the Gilded Cage. The oak-paneled hall felt like a tomb, and I was the ghost come to haunt it. Every head turned. The whispers died in throats like strangled birds. Eleanor Vane stood at the central podium, her gavel raised, her face frozen in a mask of triumph that was already starting to crack at the edges. "Sophie," Eleanor's voice shrilled, cutting through the heavy silence. "What is the meaning of this? Guards, remove this criminal from the premises." "The only criminal in this room is the one holding the gavel," I said, my voice projected with the cold, absolute authority of a man who owned the very floor she stood on. I didn't stop until I reached the front row. I didn't need to shout. The room was so quiet you could hear the heartbeat of the county. I stepped onto the raised platform, and for the first time in 10 years, I let the stable boy mask fall completely. I stood tall, my charcoal suit catching the light, looking every bit the Landlord of Lowly Acres. "The board is here to discuss the abandoned Thorne parcels," I stated, sliding a leather-bound folder onto the witness stand. "But those parcels aren't abandoned, and I am not a squatter. My name is Silas Thorne. I am the CEO of Thorne Land Management, and I hold the primary deeds to every acre of the Blackwood estate, including the one under your heels, Eleanor." What followed was a roar of disbelief. Eleanor's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled purple. She slammed the gavel down, but the sound was hollow. Because of the documents Sophie had rescued, the board members were already leaning in, their eyes wide as they scanned the evidence of Eleanor's embezzlement and the fraudulent land transfers she'd tried to force. "This is a lie!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking. "Sophie, tell them he's a manipulator!" Sophie stepped forward, her hand finding mine. The space between us burned with a shared victory. "He didn't manipulate me, Mother. He saved me. And while you were busy trying to sell me to the highest bidder, he was busy saving the families you tried to ruin. I'm not signing the annulment, I'm signing the witness statement for the state auditor." Chapter 23, Falling Action, The Ruins of Empire. The end came not with a bang, but with the cold click of real handcuffs. Moments later, the state auditors and the real deputies, the ones Eleanor couldn't buy, marched into the hall. They didn't go for me. They went for Eleanor. She looked small suddenly as they led her away from the podium she had used as a throne for decades. The room cleared slowly, leaving Sophie and me alone in the center of the hollow chamber. The high-stakes conflict that had threatened to tear us apart had instead forged us into something unbreakable. I looked at the gavel lying abandoned on the floor. Truth be told, the crown felt lighter now that she was sharing the weight. "It's over," Sophie whispered, leaning her head against my shoulder. "The Vane name is gone." "No," I corrected, pulling her into my arms. "The Vane name is yours to redefine. But the land? The land belongs to the people now." As the silence roared in the empty hall, I made my final executive decision. I didn't want to be the Baron in the high tower. I didn't want the command center to be my only world. Rather, I wanted the life we had started in the mud, but with the power to make sure the mud stayed clean for everyone else. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, I had signed the papers to convert the Blackwood Riding Club into a public land trust. I was relinquishing the crown to give the county back its soul. Chapter 24, Resolution, The Sanctuary. 1 week later, the fog had lifted, replaced by a crisp, golden autumn morning. We didn't go to the Thorne estate. We didn't move into a mansion with a chef and a fleet of cars. Instead, we returned to the shack at the edge of the woods. Sophie was on the porch, wearing her old flannels and a pair of sturdy work boots. She wasn't a mannequin in her mother's hands anymore. She was the woman who had managed to tame the landlord. Inside, the wood stove was roaring, a real fire this time, started with a single match and a lot of heart. "The roof still leaks a little in the corner," I said, walking up the steps with a bag of groceries from Miller's. "I like the leaks," she said, smiling as she took the bag. "They remind me that nothing is perfect, and they remind me of the night I decided to marry a stable boy. Truth be told, I realized then that the test had never been for her. It was a test for me. I had to learn that I was lovable without the money, without the deeds, and without the power. I had found the one person who saw through the nothing and found the man inside. As the sky darkened into a peaceful, starlit purple, we sat on the porch swing. Her bones remembered me, and my soul answered. We weren't the landlord and the socialite anymore. We were just Silas and Sophie, two people who had found a kingdom in a one-room shack. Between one breath and the next, I realized for the first time in my life, I wasn't watching the world from the shadows. I was finally standing in the light. Epilogue: The New Harvest. The Blackwood Riding Club was gone. In its place stood the Thorne Veterinary School and Community Park. No one knew the rugged man teaching the kids how to brush down the horses was the same man who had funded the entire project. They just called him Silas. Sophie was there too, her hands stained with soil as she worked in the community garden. She looked free. She looked like a flame in the darkness that had finally found enough wood to burn forever. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the way the world worked when you stopped trying to own it and started trying to live in it. I looked at the horizon, at the land I no longer owned but finally loved. I felt it, clear as day. I wasn't the landlord of Lowly Acres anymore. I was just a man who had finally come home. And she let it happen.